I am very excited to start building my GGHD. The GGHD is a Game Gear consolizer from GameBox. I want to give a huge shout out to GameBox for sending me this kit for free, and while they don't influence this video at all, I do want to thank them for supporting the channel and for making this video possible. The first step in building a GGHD is to have a working Game Gear. Now, this Game Gear has seen better days for sure. The LCD screen here is very dim and it's very difficult to play, but that makes this a really good candidate for a GGHD install because we won't be needing the screen and we won't be needing some of the other components inside of the actual case. Your GGHD kit should come with a capacitor replacement kit, so I went through already and replaced all the capacitors in the main PCB here, as well as the capacitors in the power board and audio board, just to get the Game Gear up and running. Now, I do have to say that the process for replacing the capacitors is really obnoxious, so I'm not going to cover it here, although I will mention that I manually recapped this. I did not use a hot air rework station. I've seen too many videos where people use a hot air rework station to take the capacitors off of the Game Gear and components go flying and things, so I think if you're going to do this, in my opinion, I think you should do it manually using a soldering iron. Now, I will have to say that you won't be needing the power board or the audio board in the GGHD install, so if you can get the main PCB recapped, I think you should be okay there. But if you want to verify that the Game Gear is working, you probably should do all the capacitors and check it with that. I'm going to be starting with the Game Gear already halfway taken apart, so let's unplug these cables here from both the audio and the power board. Now we have to completely remove the Game Gear motherboard from the case here, so let's unscrew these screws. Keep in mind that we do need to save these two larger screws that are attached to the cartridge slot. I am going to be following the GGHD installation guide that's available on their website, and I probably should have mentioned earlier that this GGHD is only compatible with VA0 and VA1 Game Gears. You can see which version it is along the top side of the PCB here. So this is a VA1 Game Gear. And the other thing I should mention is that there's two different versions of Game Gear motherboards. There is a 1 ASIC version, which is what I have. That's this big chip right here. There's also a 2 ASIC version, and there's different steps depending on which ASIC version that you have. So if you have a 1 ASIC version, you can follow along with what I'm going to do pretty much step for step. But if you have a 2 ASIC version, you should consult the GGHD installation guide for the slightly different steps. The first step to installing the GGHD in this 1 ASIC Game Gear is to actually remove a bunch of the capacitors that I just replaced. I know it's a little annoying to have to remove some of the capacitors that we just replaced, but it's worth it to know that your Game Gear is working correctly. Let's start by removing some of these capacitors. It's probably worth removing the solder that's left behind from removing those caps with some solder braid. You need to really make sure that you don't lose any components in this part of the board when you're using the solder braid. Now we have to desolder this gray component, this blue component, and this big yellow component. These are through holes, so we can desolder them from the back of the board. Let's start by adding some fresh solder to everything. I'm going to be using my Hakko FR301 desoldering iron for this, but if you don't have one of those, you can try to use one of these really nice solder suckers. I'll leave a link in the description for both of these tools. Oh, it looks like I missed a leg here. Oh, haha, that's funny. Now I'm going to switch to my knife edge tip so that we can remove these two surface mount components right here. We should be able to put a big blob of solder on the side with the 3 legs here. Oh, and it pretty much comes off by itself, so let's just slide it off like that. Let's do the same thing with this component here. And let's clean up the solder with some solder braid. Let's clean up everything with some isopropyl alcohol. Well, that was fun. Now it's time to remove this big reflective shield and the CFL bulb underneath. So I think there's 2 more screws I need to take out. And now this reflective shield should come off. And the screen is kind of loose too, so just be careful. Okay, let's flip the board over like this. Just be careful of the screen down here. There's 6 points that we need to desolder around the edges here to get rid of the CFL tube. So let's add some solder. And now we can desolder everything. Okay, so the tube fell out. Now we should be able to remove these fuses here. We might have to heat them up from the top here. Whoops. We need to make sure that there's no more solder left on any of these points, so I'm going to try to clean up them with my solder braid. Let's flip this over again, and we need to remove the tape gently on the bottom here, this green tape. I don't think we need to completely remove it, just the part that is stuck to this ribbon cable. Now we have to remove this green ribbon cable, and what we have to do is kind of gently drag solder down these pins and lift up on the ribbon cable at the same time. And now the screen is completely detached. Let's use some more solder braid on the whole length of this. I did end up lifting one of the pins here, but I didn't rip it off, so I just kind of nudged it back into place. You want to be very careful when you're removing the solder from these pins, or otherwise you're going to damage them. Next, we're going to do something that is one ASIC specific. If we flip the board over, we need to remove and bridge 4 of the resistors in the corner here. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some fresh solder to both sides of the resistors. Now to remove these resistors, I'm going to use a fairly simple technique with my chisel tip. I'm going to add a little bit of liquid flux here, and then I'm going to heat up one of the ends and then quickly switch over to the other end, and hopefully the resistor will just kind of fall off. With the resistors removed, all we have to do is bridge the 2 pads. Since these resistors are so close together, you want to make sure that you don't bridge 2 of the resistors together. You want to just connect the 2 pads of a single resistor. It's probably going to be very easy to do what I did and bridge 2 resistors together with a big blob. But that's alright, we could take the solder off and try again. Probably would have helped if I added flux. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and clean it up. Now it's time to install the main GGHD board, so let's put it in place here. Now we want to make sure that our GGHD board is sitting as flat as possible against the Game Gear. If there are any tiny gaps between the GGHD board and the Game Gear, you should clean it up with some solder braid, make sure that there's no solder in the way. Alright, now we want to make sure that the castellations on the edge of the GGHD board are lined up with the pins below it, but we're not going to solder those yet. We're going to be soldering some of the vias in the cartridge pins here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the second one over in the top row, just so that we have one to start with. So let's fill the via up with some solder. Then what we're going to do is we're going to heat that via back up again and push down on the GGHD board so that it's making good connection with the Game Gear board. Now we're going to count 8 over from this top right side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that is the next hole we're going to solder. So remember to push down when you solder this. You can keep checking to make sure there's no gap here between the boards. Now we're just going to solder the via directly to the left of the one we just soldered. Now there's one more via we're going to solder on the bottom row. We're going to count over 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then add some solder. Push down. With all those vias soldered, now we can solder these castellations, these exposed solder points, to the pins down here. This is going to be hard for me to record on video, but we're going to heat up the pin and the castellation. Add some solder. Something like that is a pretty good joint. Now we've just got to do the rest. If you do end up bridging one of these pins, you should be able to remove it with some solder braid. And you also want to make sure that you're actually soldering the pins to the castellations. You see I have 2 here that are not connected at all. All right, there we go. All the castellations together and all the vias soldered. There are 2 more vias at the top of the board here that secure the GGHD board on the top. So let's go ahead and fill those with some solder to secure it. We're going to add a bunch of solder at first. Then I'm going to hold both of the boards together and heat it up again, just to make sure that the 2 boards are as close as possible together. Now that we've secured the GGHD board to the Game Gear, we have to solder some wires from the pads on the GGHD board to some spots on the Game Gear itself. Another reminder, the steps that I'm going to do are specifically for the 1 ASIC Game Gear. So if you have a 2 ASIC Game Gear, you have to check the guide for where your wires need to go. So let's flip the board over. Tucked under here is a pad that's labeled GG Clock. I'm going to use this silicone wire. I think this is 30 gauge. It might be 28, but I think it's 30. I know this is kind of hard to see, but I'm going to tin that GG Clock pad. And I'm going to tin my silicone wire. For the 1 ASIC Game Gear, we need to solder to one of these 2 gold pads right here. So first, I'm going to secure the end that I tinned to that GG Clock pad. Like that. Then I'm going to measure the wire out and cut it to length. And we need to strip and tin the other side. Let's tin the pad. Add some liquid flux to it, and then solder the wire. Here's sort of a weird one. So there is this little pad marked T10 underneath the 1 ASIC here. It needs to get wrapped around to the other side and soldered to the bottom of the GGHD board down here. So I guess we can start on the GGHD side since we're here. So let's solder this pad. Get our wire soldered to it. Then flip the board over. Tin T10. Cut our wire and solder our wire to it. All right, let's flip the board back over. We're going to focus on these points over here. So M3, M4, and M5. They correspond to points on the board, M5, M4, and M3 up here. So let's tin all of these points. And then we can solder the wires between the points. There are 3 more pads on the same side, so let's solder those too. Let's start with the one that's closest to the wires that we already soldered. And that's going to get soldered to this pad labeled M16. The pad in the middle is going to go to M14. Then this last wire here will go here to M15. Of course, there are more wires on the other side of the board. Right audio goes to M41. Left audio to M42. This bottom pad, which is up, goes to M10. This top pad, which is right, goes to M13. The next pad is left, and that goes to M12. And the last pad is down, goes to M11. And that is all the wiring on both sides. With all the wiring done, we can finally get the GGHD installed into the case. In order for the board to fit inside the case, we need to take some needle nose pliers to these little tabs on the extension port here. So we just need to carefully bend these tabs down. And then this one here. That's a little bit annoying to do, but if you take your time, you should be able to bend them in like that. Now we need our controller port out of the bag along with the little flex cable. And we're going to take these screw posts out. And take the metal cover off. Now we can open this connector on the controller port and put the flex cable into it with the blue side facing up. And then put the tab down. Then here on the GGHD board, we could do the same thing with the other end. Now we need this little power button as well as the bottom of the case. Let's put the power button into the case. Now we could put the controller PCB into the front of the case and then fold the whole Game Gear board over top of it. You need to make sure that the button stays in front of the button on the PCB and doesn't fall out. We can reach into our bag of screws and we're going to look for these small silver screws, and we can take those silver screws and attach the PCB to the case. Then we could take the long screws that we saved when we took the Game Gear apart and put them back around the cartridge slot. Now we can add the thin middle part. We need to hook it around the controller port in the front and line it up with everything else. And let's move this cable out of the way so we can add our top piece. On the bottom side, we need to take one of our long screws and line up one of the PCB holes for the controller port in the front. We need to try to put our screw through that and screw it in a little bit. Then we can screw in the other 3 screws. And that's what it looks like with everything all screwed together. There is one more finishing touch, and that is to fill these 3 ovals with these 3D printed pieces. I'm going to use the gray ones that they sent me, but I don't think I'm going to use VHB tape or anything because I may want to reprint this case. So I'm going to use a little bit of hot glue to stick these 3D printed pieces in there. I'm just going to use a little bit. I hope it doesn't melt the plastic too much. I think that looks pretty cool with the 3 gray ovals. The only thing left to do is to plug it in and test it out. Okay, as you can see, I'm having some problems with my GGHD, but before we get into that, let's talk about how to use the OSD. If you hold down, start, and C on your Genesis controller, the GGHD OSD will be displayed. First, let's go into display settings. These are all the default settings, so there's different resolutions that you can choose, 480p, 720p, and 1080i. I'm gonna leave mine on 720p for now. There's different types of scaling you could choose, so prop is probably proper pixel sizing. STR is stretch, and TV is kind of like shrunk down a little bit, but it's that proper scaling. Then the overscan setting does something similar to the TV scaler setting. I guess if you wanted to use this on a CRT or something, you could use this to avoid the picture kind of going outside of the TV's overscan area. Then there's 2 different aspect ratios, DAR and PAR. I don't really know what the difference is between those. Then if we press B, we can go back to the other menus. So there's a picture config menu. In the picture config, we have 3 different filters. There's enhanced, which is just a little bit smooth out. Then there's smooth, which is like super smoothed out filter. And then sharp, which I'm not sure what the difference is between no filter and sharp filter. It looks like it changes the color and sort of blends the colors together a little bit better. You can also change the brightness of the filters. There is a gamma correction feature which changes the color quite a bit actually. I know this isn't the greatest game to check out this gamma correction, and as you can see I have these color lines all over the screen. There are a couple of different grid settings, so there's this one, then like a little bit larger one, then there's an even smaller one that makes the screen kind of darker, and there are a few different scanline options. And then in the info screen you just get the firmware version, the build date, and the credits. Now I want to give some honest feedback about the GGHD. I think we should start with the positives. First of all, I really enjoyed the install. I think if you've never worked with the Game Gear, it is a little annoying to do the Game Gear recap, but the actual install of the GGHD kit, going through all the steps, I think is really enjoyable. I think if you're a beginner modder, this kit is going to challenge you, and there's a good mixture of easy to solder things as well as some more advanced stuff like surface mount soldering and soldering to those castellated edges. The case is really satisfying to assemble, and it looks nice when it's all together. And I'm glad that it has Sega Genesis controller support because anything else would be just wrong. I think the sound output is pretty good, especially if you've only ever heard the stock Game Gear speakers. This is gonna blow you away. And from what I could tell from the video output, other than those flashing color bars everywhere, I think it looks pretty nice and sharp even at 720p. There are quite a bit of features in the OSD that I wasn't really expecting, like the filtering, the gamma correction, different grid and scanline options. But unfortunately, that's the end of the positives, so let's get to the negatives about the GGHD. In a nutshell, the GGHD is pretty much unusable for me. As you saw in the footage when I was going through the OSD menu, there were these weird color bars all over the screen, and it kind of gets worse over time. So in the beginning, you might not notice them, but as the console warms up, they just get worse and worse, and you can't really even tell what's going on the screen sometimes. I mean, it's still playable, but it's definitely not what I expect for a reliable consolizer. Postman says this issue is caused by poor HDMI cables or non-gold plated HDMI cables, but I've tried at least half a dozen different high quality HDMI cables and they all have the same issue with the color bars. There is another and arguably worse issue with the GGHD, and that's something that I'm going to call the rainbow screen of death. The first time that you turn on your GGHD, you'll probably get a successful boot. However, if you turn the consolizer off and then try to turn it right back on again, most of the time you're going to get this weird rainbow screen and the GGHD will never boot correctly. I reached out to Postman, and at first he thought it may be an issue with the actual GGHD mod board itself. He sent me a component in the mail that he thought would fix the issue, and it still didn't fix it. I actually ended up mailing him my GGHD for him to take a look at, and he figured out that there was a problem with my Game Geared motherboard, not the install, but the motherboard. He actually sent me a different verified working GGHD back, but that still didn't seem to solve my problems. In fact, all the footage that you're seeing in this video is from that second GGHD kit. The only way I found that sometimes I can get around the rainbow screen of death is to unplug the USB-C cable, unplug the cartridge, plug the USB-C cable back in, and then you can plug the cart back in. Postman mentioned that you should wait at least 5 to 10 seconds before you try to turn the GGHD back on again, but that's not guaranteed to get your GGHD to boot again, which is really frustrating if you have an EverDrive and you want to switch a game, so you power off the GGHD to try to get back to the menu, and you'll get the rainbow screen of death instead. I think that the case contributes to some of these issues. There are cutouts around the HDMI port and the USB-C port, so if you have thicker HDMI or USB-C cables, they may not actually fit all the way into the consolizer. So you're already limited to the types of cables that you can buy. First, they need to be high quality and gold plated, and second of all, they need to be thin enough to fit into the ports in the back. Because of these issues, I can't really recommend the GGHD kit, which is sort of disappointing because I've been hyping this up for a long time now, and I was hoping that the GGHD would be the main way for me to play Game Gear games. However, if you want to take a chance to see if it works with your setup and your cables, then I do think that the install was pretty enjoyable. But you'll have to decide for yourself if it's worth risking your $160. If this video helped you learn more about the GGHD kit, then give this video a like, and get subscribed so you don't miss more of my retro modding tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.